What do you think, partner? Randolph Scott demonstrated his hero status without having to yell. With a rifle in hand and a stern but determined look, all he had to do was ride a horse across the woods, and it was immediately recognizable to American listeners. That was Western-style justice. He appeared in more than 100 movies over the course of more than 30 years. More than half of them were Westerns, the genre that made him a timeless representation of a country that was both idealized and wild. Scott was the silent cowboy, a man of few words, quick actions, and unwavering values, even when he had to draw his revolver. This was in contrast to the fiery John Wayne or the reflective Gary Cooper. However, it was precisely this quiet both in real life and on screen that made his genuine story such a chilling mystery. After retiring, he lived in isolation, gave few interviews, never penned a memoir, and essentially vanished from the public eye. Randolph Scott removed himself from the public eye as though his roles were the only things he ever did. Decades later, the world was compelled to re-examine after he left behind a handwritten note revealing the secrets of his life. The American cowboy hero Randolph Scott may have defeated every monster on screen, but in real life, he was a guy who gave in to the cruelest social mores of his era and wore that scar to the very end. Despite being born on January 23, 1898, Randolph Scott's first cry did not originate in his hometown. While his parents were traveling to see relatives, he was born in Orange County, Virginia. He and his 5 siblings grew up in a magnificent ancient home created by famed architect Louis H. Asbury when the family eventually moved back to Charlotte, North Carolina. Scott's life was based on prestige, privilege, and an apparently predetermined future from an early age. George Grant Scott, his father, was an engineer. More significantly, though, he was the first certified public accountant in North Carolina. His mother, Lucille Crane, was a true pioneer, deriving from a wealthy and influential Southern aristocratic family. Randolph Scott was a member of the leadership class at a time when many aspiring Hollywood actors were brought up in poverty. He was conditioned from birth to enter the world with dignity and authority. He wasn't an opportunity seeker, he was destined to be selected. One of the most prominent all-boys boarding schools in America, Woodbury Forest educated sons of Southern political, economic, and military elites under strict rules of discipline, self-respect, and a strong sense of civic responsibility. Randolph Scott was a student there. Scott was notable there for both his athletic and academic accomplishments. He participated in sports like baseball, football, swimming, and horseback riding as a part of his identity as a Southern gentleman, not as a pastime. Later, these abilities were a logical fit for the big screen. He didn't have to learn how to shoot or ride. His blood already contained them. When the United States formally entered World War I in 1917, Randolph Scott chose to enlist in the military at the age of 19 rather than waiting to be drafted, and joined the 19th Field Artillery Regiment's 2nd Trench Mortar Unit. This event may have been the event that best characterized him. He worked in artillery reconnaissance just behind enemy lines on the front lines in France, a dangerous duty that put him in constant danger of being captured or killed by snipers. Although he never talked about what he witnessed, it is thought that the wartime experiences he had shaped the man he would become. Steely, reserved, and completely emotionally in control. He developed his hand calculation skills and instinctive ability to modify howitzer coordinates in the trenches because even one mistake may result in fatalities. He and his fellow troops held onto their dog tags, read Bibles in their pockets, and prayed that they would live to see another daybreak. After the war, Randolph Scott took his time returning home. He remained in France and became a lieutenant after attending artillery officer school. Maybe he started thinking about what he really desired during those peaceful days. For Randolph Scott still hadn't found his place even with his military credentials, honor, and family. So when he got back, he tried football at Georgia Tech again, followed family tradition by attending the University of North Carolina to study textile engineering. However, whatever route he took because he ought to did so resulted in the same outcome: emptiness. He had to give up sports due to an earlier injury. He was strangled by an accounting position at the family business. Randolph Scott gradually left the life that had been prearranged for him and entered an unpredictable world: Hollywood. Nobody could have imagined that the best cowboy to ever appear on the American cinema would be a Southern aristocrat with a soft voice, an officer's posture, and a war-worn heart. In the late 1920s, Hollywood was a battlefield covered in gold. Not everyone is called despite everyone trying to be noticed. A towering 6'3" man with the stance of a military and the soft pull of a Southern gentleman discreetly emerged from the crowd. Randolph Scott didn't need to shout to get attention because he didn't appear like the others. A pivotal 1928 golf match at the Los Angeles Country Club presented an opportunity. Howard Hughes, the infamous producer and multimillionaire, was partnered at random with Randolph Scott. Together they played 18 holes. By the end, Hughes had more than simply Scott's swing in his memory. His serene manner and uncommon cinematic presence impressed him, Everything changed with a little invitation and an anonymous supporting role. For a man Hughes felt Hollywood needed faces like that, the 1928 movie Sharpshooters was the first step. However, appearances weren't enough. Randolph Scott was aware of it. Being an attractive guy was not what he wanted. At the Pasadena Playhouse, one of the most demanding training facilities at the time, he started studying acting seriously right once. He eventually became well known for creating performers like Dustin Hoffman and Gene Hackman. He developed his voice, body language, and emotional control, but most significantly, he learned to be patient. Randolph Scott continued to play silent, nameless supporting parts throughout the early 1930s, occasionally just making brief appearances at the periphery of the frame. Despite not even receiving credit, he made a silent impression in the Virginia 1929. To make the role more realistic, he trained Gary Cooper to speak with a Southern accent. That perseverance finally paid off, as Hollywood insiders started whispering, "That guy, he's not just background." Randolph Scott was chosen for the lead part in the stage performance after Paramount Pictures held auditions for it beneath a Virginia moon. Additionally, a talent scout in the audience made a note on opening night. Then came a formal studio contract. The gates of Hollywood have opened, not for a quiet walk-on this time. He got his first lead in Henry Hathaway's Heritage of the Desert in 1932. Despite not being a box office success, the movie did affirm one thing. Randolph Scott was now headed towards the status of a true Western hero. He co-starred with Cary Grant, a little-known actor at the time, in Hot Saturday that same year. Off-screen, the two became close friends and eventually housemates, despite their roles as romantic competitors fighting for the same woman. Hollywood would later be rocked by that friendship. However, at the time, it was just a connection between two lonely individuals who were looking for a place in a cold and glittering world. The early years of Randolph Scott's career were anything from a smooth transition. He experimented with romantic comedies, horror films, Supernatural 1933, and even musicals, Roberta 1935, starring Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. But regardless of the genre, he exuded the subdued solemnity of someone who had experienced combat, calm, straight, and never ostentatious. However, Scott quickly discovered that Broadway stages and musical sets weren't his actual home. In a land without laws, he was destined to sit on a horse, wear leather, and tip a wide-brimmed hat. It was along that path, the cowboy's path, that his career would start to become legendary. One memorable role did not make Randolph Scott a star. In contrast to many actors of his day, he did not experience a big breakthrough. His career, like the characters he played, was a quiet, gradual accumulation. By pure integrity, they made it to the top without being ostentatious or rushed. After experimenting with humor, horror, and musicals during his formative years, Scott eventually retreated into the American West, where he truly belonged. He started selecting cowboy characters in the late 1930s as a sign of his strong commitment to his personal individuality. He wasn't limited to acting in westerns either. He transformed them into his own territory, a world in which heroes needed few words, just a straight back and a promise fulfilled. Movies such as Gunfighters, 1947, Colt 45, 1950, The Last of the Mohicans, 1936, and Jesse James, 1939. The Randolph Scott cowboy was influenced by The Walking Hills, 1949, and Trail Street, 1947. Though tall, calm, and ethically unflinching, their eyes never really seemed at peace. Scott was released from the tight control of major studios in 1946 when he and producer Harry Joe Brown established Renown Productions, a name derived from Randolph and Brown. He could now select his own screenplays, co-stars, and directors instead than being typecast. And he created a brand new breed of cowboy with that power. Not all strong, filled with remorse and a silent, unsaid darkness. The culmination of this period was his partnership with filmmaker Bud Baker, which produced the 7 films known as the Renown Cycle between 1956 and 1960. These productions were not ostentatious. There was no romanticized West, no elaborate scenery, and no special effects. These movies sounded more like simple ballads about sacrifice, loneliness, and the price of honor. Scott portrayed a man who was grieving over the death of his wife in a robbery in the 1956 film 7 Men From Now. Motivated by remorse, he pursues the robbers as a kind of self-punishment rather than for justice. The dagger of culpability gets deeper with each step forward. Lee Marvin, a sly and attractive criminal who represents Scott's darker side, stands in contrast to him. The film concludes with the insight that retaliation brings no peace, even with victory. The Tall T, 1957, went even farther the next year. Scott played Pat Brennan, a man who was kidnapped by a group of criminals together with an unknown individual. The shootouts were not what viewers were tormented by. It was the moral decision between sacrifice and upholding one's moral principles, between life and death. Brennan uses a piece of candy to entice a cow in one particularly memorable incident. It's straightforward but reveals his true nature, understanding rather than force. Then followed 1959's Ride Lonesome, among his career's most devastating roles.
Scott is Ben Brigade, a bounty hunter who apprehends a murderer in order to attract the murderer's brother, the man who previously hanged his wife rather than for the money. He sets fire to the tree where his wife was murdered in the epilogue, a gesture that serves as a ritual of self-forgiveness and puts a stop to the pursuit. There was a commonality among all those positions. The heroes of Randolph Scott lost faith in their ability to save the world. They merely made an effort to live honorably in a world that was already in decline. They developed into the most nuanced figures the Western genre had ever seen in that stillness. Scott consented to work with Sam Peckinpah on his last movie Ride the High Country in 1962. The narrative followed two elderly police officers on their final gold transport. One was lured by avarice, while the other was still holding fast to his principles. Scott portrayed Gil Westrom, a man torn between temptation and loyalty. He doesn't win or save anyone at the conclusion of the movie, but he makes the proper decision to leave a world in decline. Randolph Scott declared his retirement at the end of the filming process. No farewell gala, no tributes, no fanfare. He went like the cowboys, knowing that he had said all he had to say. He didn't require applause, he didn't glance back, and he played silently. Randolph Scott was the perfect man on screen, calm, strong, and always willing to defend the weaker women. However, he never really had a public romance in real life. Perhaps the most silent tragedy of his life was that he was never permitted to love the way he really wanted to. Randolph Scott married Marion DuPont Somerville, an East Coast woman of great money, social standing, and no connection to the movie industry, in 1936 instead of a fellow actress of the day. She was the daughter of one of Virginia's most prestigious families, the granddaughter of the DuPont Corporation's founder, and the well-known American horse racing queen. It was a fantastic match on paper. A budding Western film star, an Eastern legend, a cowboy hero, and a real-life aristocratic woman. They were both successful, well-liked, and leading quite different lifestyles. The mismatch was obvious from the beginning. Marion never made the leap to Hollywood. She remained at Montpelier Estate, a 55-room mansion deep in the Virginia countryside that had formerly been the residence of President James Madison. Riding high on a flourishing career, Randolph Scott continued to work on sets around California. The whole of America, and a difficult-to-bridge gap separated them. Marion still desired to provide for her husband in spite of their separation. For his use when he came to visit, she had a gym constructed in the basement. Marion had the floor dug deeper to create a gym pit for Randolph Scott, who was 6'4", so that he could stand up straight when lifting weights. It was a lovely yet strangely particular gesture, a representation of a relationship that yearned for intimacy but was unable to fully attain it. They seldom ever showed up together at public gatherings, and publications didn't include any endearing pictures or remarks. Marion was not present at the victory celebration in New York, when her beloved horse, Battleship, won the 1938 Grand National in England. Randolph Scott, the often absent spouse who was now a reluctant observer of a victory that wasn't his, served as her stand-in. They were married for 3 years before divorcing in 1939. Just a straightforward answer, with no accusations, litigation, or scandals revealed. Our distance from one another is too great. Randolph Scott's sole remark regarding the marriage. However, one minor element remains, enough to cause anyone to hesitate. Marion never mentioned Scott. 4 decades after they split up, she held onto it until her death in 1983. Not for fame. She was more important than he was in high society. Perhaps it was an unspoken farewell, or a tacit show of respect for a man who lived through her life without causing her any trouble or abandoning her. With a sigh, that short marriage came to an end. The next chapter in Randolph Scott's life, however, was one without a title, rife with mystery and intrigue, and still the focus of Hollywood rumors to this day, whereas Marion DuPont was a closed chapter written in silence. Hollywood friendships come in a variety of forms. Some are there for the publicity, while others are there for the box office profits. Cary Grant and Randolph Scott, however, were not the same. They shared a house, pets, dinners, trips, and even lengthy, inexplicable silences over their 12 years of cohabitation. When they co-starred in Hot Saturday in 1932, it all started. Scott, a rancher from the South who was still looking for a job, met Grant, an English actor who had just moved to Hollywood. They moved in together at a Malibu beachfront villa immediately after filming, which the media quickly called Bachelor Hall, the home of a pair of eligible men. They were one of the most often photographed couples of the 1930s, not on screen but in real life. Together they went camping, played golf, and unwinded by the fireplace. An image of them standing side by side in the kitchen wearing matching embroidered aprons was once featured in a newspaper, a picture so personal that it caused Hollywood to hold its breath. They are the strangest but happiest couple I have ever encountered, according to director Howard Hawks. Then the gossip started. To one another, what were they? Are they lovers or best friends? Even the slightest hint of sexual identity was a dagger to the heart in a time when homosexuality was viewed as a sin, a threat to one's profession, and the end of fame. Studios stepped in right away. For For both guys, they set up public romances. After each divorce, Cary Grant moved back in with Scott after marrying a slew of actresses. Hollywood didn't need the truth at the time. It needed a picture. And Randolph Scott, a man who had experienced the battlefield, was now caught in a different kind of conflict, with his career-building system on one side and a soulmate on the other, prepared to destroy it if necessary. They didn't confirm or deny anything for all those years. They gave no explanation. They didn't answer. They simply survived. Perhaps they had discovered something that neither of them could publicly discuss in the private realm behind the villa's gate. However, nothing endures forever. The studio issued an ultimatum by 1944. Cary Grant needs to get married. Randolph Scott must too. The end of Bachelor Hall. They parted ways. Thus, a quiet that had no other choice put an end to a friendship or a love. However, the bond never really waned. Through mutual acquaintances, they kept in touch, exchanged holiday greetings, and checked in. Scott maintained a picture of the two of them in his personal library, but he never once told the media about Cary Grant for the remainder of his life. Then Cary Grant died in November 1986. In his Beverly Hills home, Randolph Scott also passed away peacefully in his sleep on the morning of March 22, 2 months later. A cousin claims that Scott spent the entire afternoon crying by himself after burying his face in his hands upon learning of Grant's passing. Nobody is certain whether the tears were shed for love, friendship, or the years he had allowed to go unnoticed. Hundreds of romances, love and hate, splits and reconciliations, fallouts, and makeup have all occurred in Hollywood. However, only Cary Grant and Randolph Scott remain silent, and the world is still left wondering, almost a century later, if love can ever be properly experienced if it is never permitted to exist in the open. At the peak of his fame in 1944, just when Hollywood rumors started to circulate, he refused to. Randolph Scott unexpectedly married after passing away. Patricia Stillman, a modest, little-known actress who was 13 years his junior and made virtually no impact on the entertainment business, was the woman who entered his life this time. Unlike other A-list marriages, there was no media frenzy or romantic love story. To avoid suspicion, everything happened too quickly, too easily, and too safely. The more amazing thing is that this marriage lasted for 43 years. Some old acquaintances said, Scott didn't marry for love, he married for peace, a place to settle, a public image to maintain, a choice made to put an end to lingering questions. Together, they led a tranquil life free from controversy, separation, and divorce. They lived in a house in Beverly Hills, away from the spotlight, and adopted 2 children, Christopher and Sandra. Scott had stopped dating. He stopped going to parties, cut relations with Hollywood, and started making movies and making money. Some claim that he had indeed found peace, while others think it was just the last concession in a life that was never lived according to one's own wishes. Scott continuously shied away from discussing his love life and sidestepped inquiries regarding his relationship with Cary Grant, even after getting married and having kids. His responses in the few interviews he did give were succinct and unrevealing. I am content with my family. Now life is easy. Nothing profound, not even a word of love. The same was true of Patricia Stillman. She led a quiet life, rarely made public appearances, never discussed their marriage, never authored memoirs, and never went to any public gatherings following Scott's passing. She held their 2 children's hands while standing quietly next to the coffin during his funeral in 1987. She didn't speak to the media, and only gave a slight nod when someone brought up Cary Grant. Maybe Patricia was more of a friend than a lover, and she still decided to stay even though she knew everything. Maybe she realized that sometimes being present at the right time, in the right place, and in the right way, is more important to love than having something to aid a man in surviving in a society that forbade him from being who he truly was. The union with Patricia wasn't a romantic tale of romance. It marked the end of a life filled with inconsistencies, scars, and quiet. Once heralded as America's ideal cowboy, he lived out the rest of his days behind towering walls in a house devoid of gunfire, cheers, and the peace he had once imagined while standing in the deserts of the Western movie sceneries. Randolph Scott moved away from the screen in 1962. He decided to stop his career when still at the top, not because he had run out of roles, his time had gone, or his health was failing. One of the last outstanding westerns of the Golden Age is his last movie, Ride the High Country, and silent yet proud farewell. He then disappeared from Hollywood. Unlike many older colleagues, there were no cameos, interviews, or party appearances. Randolph Scott vanished in the same manner as a cowboy fleeing a firefight, gently, methodically, and without turning around. But it wasn't a lonely or impoverished life. Instead, he lived out his latter years in a kind of low-key wealth that few could have imagined, not because of movies, but rather because of astute financial instincts. Randolph Scott was secretly making real estate investments as early as the 1950s, while the majority of his colleagues were still performing or spending money. In addition to being a co-owner of the Cresta Verde Golf Club, one of California's top resorts at the time, he acquired key land holdings in Palm Springs and the San Fernando Valley. Over the following 20 years, the value of such homes increased significantly. In addition, he maintained a covert but very successful financial network, owned commercial real estate, and owned stock in private investment companies. Randolph Scott's estimated net worth at the time of his death in 1987 was $100 million, or about $280 million in modern currency.